This is our Central Idea series, and we've chatted a lot about principles, theory, and designing by styles. However, there is another way to frame your thinking about achieving an amazing garden design. So we're going to create a series where the design thinking is simply based on a central idea. What do you think about that, Saj?
I think that sounds great. And I think the key idea here really is that we are all about what is the purpose of your garden. So we're thinking about not so much the traditional garden design elements, so your formal, your contemporary, your cottage. We're thinking about things that you might not necessarily find in a book or in a course, but things that you might be interested in anyway.
Great, because a garden central idea could be based on like a philosophical driver or the location of your site, or just even a principle feeling about what you want to achieve out of your garden or something you want to showcase. There's a great range in this series, and we will talk through, once we identify each central idea, we talk through that layout, the plants, materials and features that all honour that central idea.
And keep you true to your purpose. Let's go, Fleur.
Fantastic. I'm Fleur, and I'm joined by my co-host and longtime friend, Sachi. We're second career landscape designers and bring our life experience and a fresh perspective to designing gardens.
And I'm Sachi, and you're listening to the On Garden Design podcast, where we chat about what makes a garden great, and we try to inspire and make designing accessible to anyone interested in gardens. So, Fleur, we're talking about a central idea, and today it's about a sense of place. Why are we talking about this?
Yeah, we're talking about it because this word, this frame, this term, sense of place, gets used a lot in landscape designers' language. And sometimes I think it's a bit of a overstatement, and sometimes you can say it's done absolutely beautifully. And it is a central idea, and it does define often how someone designs a space.
So tell us about that.
Yeah. So sense of place is often a strong and decisive trigger which is taken from the surrounding broader context of your landscape. Okay, so it's really clear in a place like a rural area or bushland or somewhere that has a nod to sort of the natural heritage and natural landscape. But it can be applied in other areas as well.
So I'm really thinking about where it's very obvious is where you're borrowing a view, or you've got a continuation of a vista in some way that you're drawing on, and you might be making sure that your garden is a part of that and continues into it. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes a garden and its setting has such a strong sense of place that you can't deny it. And it just would be wrong to put a different style garden in if you've got something that's so obvious and just can't be ignored.
And let me give a silly example of this. So you're in Palm Springs in the US and you try and put a rainforest garden in.
That's right.
There you go.
You're denying the sense of space. You're in Palm Springs, that's a desert area. You need to honour the climate and the environment that you're in.
That's right. And I think this is like there's lots of different elements here. We're talking about, this is about the landscape, it's about the views, it's about the culture.
Yeah.
So all of those things make up what actually is in the context in which you are in that you need to be thinking about if you're going to really try and make this the purpose of your garden, that it fits into that context, the sense of place.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what we're doing is we're taking cues from the broader setting and we're amplifying something that's already there. So a lot of people will choose to live in a place where they actually love that for what it is. So they love it. They do a tree change or a sea change or whatever it is because they love that environment. So when it comes to looking for the cues that are the central idea to building your garden, you say, what is it that I just can't ignore around here? And if it is the sort of coastal vegetation that surrounds you or the bushland, then honouring that by embracing that as your main focal point and your purpose for your garden.
It's almost easier with this topic to talk about what it is not. So this is not manipulating your garden so that it is very different to the environment in which you are finding yourself. So as I said, and a pretty silly example with the desert rainforest example, this is about if you're in a natural bushland type setting or you have rock as your foundation to your garden, you're not excavating all the rock to create some deep loamy soils by bringing all of these inputs into your garden, you're working with the rock, you're leaving it there, you're honouring it because it's part of the place.
Yeah, that's right. You're honouring it. And, that also comes into bringing in vegetation that's endemic species in that particular area, bringing in or mirroring the colour schemes. So you might be looking at, particularly in an Australian bush setting, you're bringing in a lot of those
Ochres
muted,
and reds.
yeah, and the muted greens of the eucalypts and maybe some of the ochres, and look at what the sort of soil and the sort of tree bark colours are, and bringing that into your garden. So you're sort of honouring that broader context.
So let's talk about how we do this.
Right. So how we do this is we take cues from the broader setting and then we amplify something that's already there. So what those cues might be is the surrounding vegetation, or it might be the geology itself. And you referred to the example of rock. It might be weathered timbers, ornamental native endemic grasses, sculptural sort of trees. We often see that in the Victorian coastline with some of the shapes of the mooners. They're really wind kind of twisted and all that.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, and salt bush and that kind of stuff, well, that all exists around there on the coastal areas, and bringing that in and making that sort of the features and the key elements in your garden.
And I think actually one of the things, sort of the foundational piece here for me about place is we all have a predisposition to make our blocks flat or terrace them so that they kind of, are easy to use and fit in with our lifestyles and how we want to use our gardens. I think if we're really thinking about maintaining that central, this is part of the landscape, actually the land contours are really important. We want to be reflecting. If you're in a hilly area, then having a completely flat garden starts to look a bit weird. You need to be thinking about how much you draw on the levels, or, use the contours, do some, nice shaping that reflects what is around you. So I'm really thinking about the foundations of the garden, so your layout, and how you use that to reflect your place.
That's a really good point, because if you're in quite a sort of a flowing, undulating and natural landscape, that might lend itself then to having quite a curvaceous terracing system. So you got to work with that slope, but having clear linear cut terraces probably isn't conducive to that broader context.
That's right.
It's going to feel jarring.
It will. So how can you fit in what you're doing in that place? And ditto, if you're in a really, flat environment, then you probably don't want to think about necessarily huge amounts of vertical hardscaping in what you do. That block views where actually the sense of it is very open and that you can see for miles, and that's actually what sets that sense of place.
Yeah, and actually you just made me think about quite flat or low-lying areas that are naturally inclined to get a bit of marshy and pond build-up and that sort of thing. So it really is about maybe, a water garden is the right thing, or having a series of sort of ponds that lead to a natural drainage system, building in swales that allow the flow of the water. So you're not working against it. You're not just trying to sink it all into a sump, but you're doing you're honouring the fact that it's maybe when you get rainfall events, there's a lot of rain that you need to actually slow and spread and then sink.
And in fact, I might just jump at that from the other side where, if you're in an environment where actually you've got quite shallow soils, lots of rock, that you're working again. So a lot of this is about working with what you've got rather than working against it.
Yeah.
So, you might want to be thinking much more about plants that will cope in areas that have bedrock, they have shallow rooting systems, that might not need so much water if you're in a very dry area, that your planting is actually going to reflect your environment too. So you might end up with rockeries and, succulents and some of your really hardy native species that will do much better there too.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've been sort of envying Beth Chatto's gravel garden, and I bought a book about it, and I thought, I'd love to be able to recreate that. And then I got to page 2 of the book, and it explains how deep the shale actually is in the area where she lives. And it was 2 meters deep of shale. And I thought, I don't have that. I have.
This isn't going to work here.
No, I have about 10 centimetres of topsoil, and then you hit clay. It's like, actually, that's really not going to work. So
Don't fight it.
No, and
go with the clay.
It was a really kind of like aha moment of, oh yeah, you can't just recreate things that you see or you feel that it's a good idea into a space where the geology just doesn't support it.
That's right. And I'd actually add to that, like if we go back to the why we would do something that is about the sense of place, not only is it that it feels right for the place, but it's actually better for the place. Excavating vast quantities of clay out of your garden to replace it with some, soils that have come from somewhere else, been mined from somewhere else, or, might be bringing in some bugs or whatever that shouldn't be there, or seeds that are not good, that's not good for the environment. So this is actually probably a much more sustainable way of thinking about your garden too.
Yeah, it really is. It's quite a sensible design choice. Now, it's interesting when we think about, we've been sort of talking about places that have a good connection visually and
landscapey.
Landscapey where
topography or something.
Yeah, where you might have a bit of bushland area near you. I mean, in Canberra, we call it, it's the bush capital. We have lots of bush areas around the residential spaces.
Nature reserves.
Always have this connection with, you can just see the land as it kind of was and still is.
So it gives you cues.
You got the cues, that's right. And, we've got these sort of vast views out to the Brindabellas. So you've got this sort of sense of the type of colours and vegetation that sits around you. So we can take the cues from that. Whereas in cities where it's really quite dense. So, we can't deny the fact that there's a lot of very built-up areas, and most of our listeners are probably living in a place where the original landscape has been extremely manipulated, modified to the point where you could not identify what was there. Cities built on marshlands.
Yeah, that's right, exactly.
Massive amount of fills, reclaimed land, massive fill brought in, areas where, the drainage is such that you wouldn't know that was a really soggy space, those kind of things.
Or it's just all hardscape because it's actually a high-density city living environment.
Yeah.
So what do you do in these places?
Yeah, well, this is a really interesting one, and I was sort of thinking about this, and I think sometimes you've got to say, well, our sense of place here is the brutalist urban environment. So we've got to embrace.
Don't fight it.
That's it. We've got to embrace that.
Yeah.
And so when I look out of my, for example, I look out of my apartment window and I'm looking at a big industrial brick wall, then how do I embrace that as saying this is my sense of place? I am in an old industrial area that's now been turned into residential. So you look at that wall and think, right, I'm going to sort of amplify the brutalist architecture that surrounds me. And I did see a really clever way of a couple who did this in Sydney where they actually added in a lot of that sort of industrial effects into their own sort of design and things like brought in an artist to do a fabulous sort of graffiti mural. And so they're kind of adding to it. They're saying, we are inner city livers here. We're going to really take what we love about the inner city and we're going to bring that into our garden to honour our sense of place.
It's interesting that you say that because my first thought would be, if I'm looking out onto an industrial wall or that's part of the environment in which I'm living, maybe I want to think about embracing that wall and actually growing a creeper up it that softens it but still doesn't fight it,
Yeah.
So how do you do more of that kind of thing so that you're modifying? I mean, it's a highly modified environment. So you might modify it even more with your garden to actually make it something that's more livable for you.
Yeah. Actually, give me an example of in somewhere near Paddington in Sydney central area, there's the old, I think it's the old waterworks. Now it's disused. It's turned into a public space and they've honoured the old architecture and the machinery and all of the manipulation structures and they've added in things like vines. So this idea that the vines are reclaiming this sort of disused space, but it's done in such a way that it's publicly accessible. It's this sort of lovely sunken, but it gives a nod to the heritage of that place.
Yeah. So I think that there's two ways of doing it. It's kind of like you amplify what's there or you start to manipulate what's there. You're not fighting it, though, in either sense.
Yeah.
It's really going with what you've got and making the most of what you've got to create this sense of place that works for you.
Yeah, that's right. And And it actually is a really strong central idea when you accept that I don't want to fight with what I have. I want to honour it, amplify it, and actually celebrate it.
Yeah, that's right. And so for me, a lot of that is about, how do you draw, even if you're in, say, an inner city apartment where you can't see any green anywhere else, it's how do you draw elements from your broader context in through colour, through surfaces that still makes it feel like it should be part of this, but then you soften it perhaps with the plants that you bring in. But you are still thinking about, you might want to maintain that brutalist feel. And if you're in a place where you can grow the elephant ears, which are those massive, green, very striking plants, that might be the way that you actually start to reflect that it is a brutalist environment by having big, bold things there as well.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Yeah, and having a lot of vines and things that kind of just want to creep in and reclaim and take over. Yeah.
That's right. So what else might you do to create a sense of place?
Well, one of the other cues, so in an urban environment where you don't necessarily have this sort of brutalist architecture, but you don't also have a lot of cues from the natural landscape. So a lot of urban environments, really, your sense of place might come from the architecture of your home.
That's a good point.
Yeah,
or even of the suburb, if it was built in a particular time.
Yeah. And probably an example there when we bought into an inner city suburb in Canberra, and a lot of the architecture there was sort of 1920s, 1930s. So when we did a knockdown rebuild, because it was a very sort of old workers' cottage, we chose an architectural style that nested into the suburb and was complementary to other buildings, other houses in that area, as a heritage area. And so when people come to visit my home, they don't realise that the house was only built 14 years ago. It looks like it was built, 100 years ago.
Mm.
Yeah, it's got a few cracks in it. That's probably why.
That's the clay soil.
That's right. That's the problem about building on clay.
That's right.
And then I say to people, they're deliberate. They're to make it look old.
I like that. One of the things I was just reflecting on, and I think that where I've seen this done very well is obviously the very well-known Australian garden designer Fiona Brockhoff.
Yeah.
She has, and it's very obvious in her recent book, where she uses the plants that she's drawn on from the surrounding environment, and she manipulates them much more closely to the house where, she wants to be very deliberate about her design, but then lets them slowly become more natural so they blend into the environment. And I really like that idea that you don't necessarily need to, create something like the Australian bush can look very harsh. And so it can look, leggy and spindly if it's not well maintained. And by doing some of that shaping close to your property, for instance, if you're going to use natives, that might actually just help you, create something that is much more special than, feeling like it is a bit of unkempt bush with weeds in it, which is the way I would otherwise think about things that look like that.
Yeah. She's a great example because her work is and it's also very much about being in that Port Phillip Bay, Mornington Peninsula, that sort of area
down south, Victoria,
and it's and she really has become an expert in sort of mirroring and understanding what is endemic to that space and bringing that in, you say, really cultivating it. So it's just beautiful.
And in fact, just to be really clear on how she does a lot of her things, she will actually take some of the native plants there that are already growing and it's almost like topiary. She really prunes them hard to emphasise the sort of twisted and tortured nature of things that you find on the Australian coastline where it's really affected by the environment and the wind and the roughness. So that's the kind of thing you can do. And I'm sure that if you are in a very moist and, leafy environment, again, you might want to tame that a bit more around your house rather than letting it just look wild. But then let it go wild a bit further away from your house.
Yeah, that's a great example. And then it makes it feel like the garden is nested into the environment that it was meant to be.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that's a really nice way of describing it, nested into the environment. It really is part of the place in which it belongs.
Yeah. Sense of place gets used a lot in architectural design language, but sometimes you look at something and you think, how is that actually...
How does it belong?
And so it can be a bit overused. And maybe an architect might say, oh, because we're using some local rock in the front wall, but then it's all done in a really contemporary fashion and it doesn't really nest anyway. So I think, if you're going to use it as a central idea, really take the time to observe your surroundings, take the time to sort of unpack what feels like you're nesting your home and garden into, and what, could reasonably make it look like it really belongs in that particular street, that particular suburb, that particular rural area.
So I think it really is about thinking about your context clearly. So architecture, topography, the plants, your built environment more generally. And then obviously if there's some cultural elements as well that really stand out in your area too that you might want to bring in. And I'm thinking about if you walk, if you go through Austria, a lot of the old houses will have, red geraniums in their window boxes that really give that sense of, they are here in those alpine villages. And that's the sort of the heralding of spring and summer.
Yeah, that's right. That's beautiful. I think that's where we want to be today.
It is, absolutely. So we will be back again in another fortnight, and we'd love it if you followed us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like to leave us a review, that would be great. It would also help other people find us. And we look forward to talking with you again soon.
Fabulous. See you then.
Bye.
You're listening to On Garden Design with Fleur and Sachi. If you're enjoying this episode, let us know by buying us a coffee through the Ko-fi link in the description of each episode. And more importantly, wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review. We'd love to know your thoughts, and it would help us to share our podcast with others.